Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to part 2 of today's proceedings. So we do still have Monica in the front row, and every now and then we'll direct all the curliest questions at her when the time comes. But I'm now going to be joined on stage by a panel. But before we do that, just a few remarks I thought I'd make about the broader, bigger picture. So today's event is part of Springer Nature's Grand Challenges program. So, in case you haven't noticed, the world is facing some really complex global problems that need to be addressed to ensure that humanity has a healthy and sustainable future. So scientists, social scientists, engineers and other researchers must collaborate across disciplines, as we've heard this morning, to advance solutions that policymakers and business leaders and broader society can implement to address these grand challenges. So the Grand Challenges program aims to highlight the best work published on these topics. So it's all about research-based solutions to real-world problems. And you can read more about the program at grandchallenges.springernature.com. And I might just reiterate that we've got a hashtag for today's event, Nature Sussed in Oz, and we've got a nice collection, an overview for people tweeting of the handles of the various people that you see here on stage. So now we're ready for part 2 of today's proceedings. So we've just experienced a record-breaking warm June and July across the planet. Dry July has a very different meaning for a lot of farmers across Australia who are experiencing continuing drought. We're also in the midst in Australia of a waste and recycling crisis. We're seeing here and overseas there's more energy and climate policy wars. There's threats to EPA pollution controls in the United States. Goodness knows what was happening last night in assorted meetings in Europe. And the need for evidence-based policy and action is increasingly urgent. So how do we bring the evidence makers in academia together with the policy makers in government and actors in industry and the business sector? Well, fortunately, I've got an excellent panel here to solve all of the world's problems, or at least have some discussion in that direction. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panellists. So now I'm going to have to reorder my notes here, so I'll go from a logical across the stage. Let's start off with, just to my left, you're right, Professor Rebekah Brown. She's Director of Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. Rebekah is also a Director of the RISE, Revitalising Urban Settlements and Their Environments program, which is focused on Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and it's funded by the Wellcome Trust. She was formerly the Chief Research Officer at the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities, and she's recently been appointed to the new board of EPA Victoria. So please make Rebekah welcome. Now, next to Rebekah, we have Kath Rowley. Rowley or Rowley? Rowley. Yes. Okay, there you go. Executive Director of Climate Change Division in Victoria's Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Kath was previously General Manager of Reviews at the Climate Change Authority, an independent agency established in 2012 to advise the Australian government on climate mitigation policy. So she has that lens of having looked at a federal government level but also a state government level more recently. Then next to Kath we have Scientia, is that how you said it, or Scientia? Right. Professor Veena Sahajwalla, who is Director for the Centre of Sustainable Materials Research and Technology, which has a great acronym, SMART, at UNSW. Veena has featured on television as one of the judges on ABC's New Inventors show, and she's internationally known as the inventor of green steel. She was also the winner of the 2012 Banksia Sustainability Award for Innovation, and this year she was elected by her peers as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences. So please make her welcome. And finally, on the far end, we have Dr. Robyn Schofield, who came all the way from the University of Melbourne, where she is Senior Lecturer for Climate System Science, Director of Environmental Science Hub at the University of Melbourne. Now, she's also an expert on the chemistry of atmospheric pollutants and has worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which I was telling someone the other day that, space nerds are really into NASA, weather nerds are really into NOAA, and she's worked for them. So please make all of our panel welcome. So by way of introduction, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to just to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their current work and what makes them excited about it. So starting with you, Rebekah, what are you currently focused on, and what, what's the aim of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so my major research project at the moment is we're revitalising 24 slums using water-sensitive technologies and green infrastructure, 12 in Makassar, Indonesia, and 12 in Suva, Fiji. And we're really testing this idea of if you can provide green infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure that's not dependent on fossil fuels, as an alternative way of providing clean water, flood protection and sanitation to the poorest, the urban poor, does that actually have a material impact on people's health, particularly gastrointestinal health? So it's looking at green infrastructure, but it's also a preventative medicine project, which is why it's funded by the Wellcome Trust. But it's also a potential infrastructure solution. There's over 1 billion people that live in informal settlements today, and over the next 30 years that'll grow to 3.5 billion. So it's the new normal. It's not something we're going to eradicate anytime soon.
Just quickly, because you're a civil engineer by trade, is that right? Or engineering, at least in the background?
Yeah, I'm originally a civil engineer, but I'm a professor of sociology, so I'm a sociologist. A scholar. Actually, I don't know what I am sometimes. Square peg, round hole. Probably like most people here.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you talk about green infrastructure, and I think when people, if they don't know what that is and they're thinking an engineer talking about it, we're not talking about bridges painted green, are we? We're not talking about concrete and steel. Tell us a little bit about what is green infrastructure.
Oh, that's tough sitting. I'm sitting here next to Veena. Green infrastructure is infrastructure that works, it works in a more sensitive way with the physical environment. In my view of the world, it's got something to do with the content of the material, the serviceability of that infrastructure, particularly for civil works type infrastructure. My view is the more modular, the more flexible it is, the more resilience it's going to have to natural phenomena and climate change and other risks that communities need to live with. I think that it's a real challenge, particularly in places like Melbourne, to mainstream sustainable infrastructure, but we have an opportunity to mainstream it, particularly in the global south, perhaps more readily. And what we're seeing in developed cities or in Western economies, we're seeing a blend of sustainable infrastructure being retrofitted with unsustainable or less sustainable infrastructure. So you don't want to be using nasty chemicals. You want to minimise the use of fossil fuels, and the actual design of the infrastructure itself is really smart, and it's designed to service communities better. It's designed to open up our physical landscape so it's more inclusive of all. If you look at our sort of typical suburbs, they're designed usually for not families, for a traditional male worker who sits in a car and drives to work. It's not particularly pram friendly, family friendly. Parks are designed largely for young boys rather than young girls. We know all that now. So there's ways of designing infrastructure that's also more inclusive as well. Yeah. So for me, green infrastructure represents layer upon layer.
And it's not just roads and sewage systems and stormwater drains. It is also urban vegetation and parks, as you say, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's also thinking about green space and bushland as part of the infrastructure of a place. And then of course there's non-hard infrastructure, social infrastructure, which is institutions and rules and norms and behaviours, and that's an infrastructure as well.
Oh, big ideas.
But I'm sure that you'll be more articulate about smart infrastructure.
Kath? Yes.
Great, okay. So I'm excited about a whole bunch of reforms that we're currently pursuing. So it's only my second. I've been in the Victorian government now for 2 years, and what's really exciting is that we have a government that is pursuing a very strong and ambitious reform agenda across a really wide range of activities, certainly not exclusive to environment. They've got massive infrastructure and social justice and other agendas as well. But within my sphere of, kind of influence, two big ones, the environment protection reforms and the climate change reforms. And so in the environment protection space, the government commissioned an independent review of the Environment Protection Authority when it first came into government, so now about 3.5 years ago. And it was the first kind of roots and branch review of EPA since it was established back in 1970. And so this was a really significant reform of one of Victoria's key environmental institutions. And the inquiry did an extensive public consultation process and came up with this very substantial reform agenda, which the government has really embraced. And so last year, a bill went through Parliament to reform the governance of the EPA, which is kind of a bit boring, but it's actually really important. It's about getting a real mix of skills and experience, including people like Rebekah, onto a professional board of the EPA to oversee its operations. It also did things like really lift the profile of the EPA's science agenda, and particularly through things like establishing the role of Chief Environmental Scientist, and by bringing in some of the public health functions that previously resided in the Department of Health into the EPA. And so that was the kind of governance, making it a more modern and multidisciplinary, but with this very strong science basis to its work. The second tranche and the most substantial tranche of reform is before Parliament at the moment, and it's the overhaul of the Environment Protection Bill. And it's basically moving Victoria's environmental regulation from a respond to pollution basis to a prevent pollution basis. And so making it a bit more like our health and safety laws, which are all about businesses and anyone conducting an activity that could have an impact on the environment, understanding the risks of that activity, and in a proportionate way, minimising those risks where possible and managing them where it's not possible to avoid them. And so that's called the General Environmental Duty, and that sits right at the core of what is the proposed new environmental regulation framework for Victoria. So that's pretty exciting, and there's a huge body of work that went into that, and there's an even bigger body of work which, if the bill is passed, will go into implementing it. And that's where the board and the EPA as a whole will be doing an enormous amount of work with the community and with business over the coming years. In the climate change space, the government enacted the Climate Change Act last year. Parliament enacted it. And this is kind of, again, part of a response to an independent review commissioned by the government. And it's basically reinvigorating the state's role in climate change action, not just on reducing emissions, but also dealing with the impacts of climate change. And in a way, the Act is kind of like a mini Paris Agreement. It sets up this architecture where Victoria is required to set targets every 5 years for its emissions reductions to a goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and that net zero goal is in the legislation. And then there's this 5-year rolling strategy process where the government has to, for all of the key emitting sectors and for all of the systems like natural systems, health, water systems, whole range of systems that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, or will play a key role in Victoria's response, things like built environment or education, on the adaptation side. So we have this 5-year rolling strategy of emission reduction policies and adaptation action plans, which basically are intended to position Victoria to transition in a kind of steady way, rather than a let's all sit around, do nothing and then fall off a cliff way, to that end game of net zero climate resilient by 2050. And so again, we're working across government and with community and business on the implementation of that legislation, and another really exciting thing.
Well, that sounds exciting, and normally people don't describe something that someone talks about from government as exciting. So I think you're probably a lot more engaged with different players than people might perceive. So would that be right?
Yeah, well, I think every part of our activity touches, like a whole range of different stakeholders. The nature of public policy is that you're trying to solve wicked problems. Government doesn't really spend a lot of time on something if no one's interested in it. And so one of the other things in my area is waste and recycling, and that's been a little bit in the spotlight for the last, few months, few years, and it's just getting more and more and more prominent in public discussions. So, yeah, I think everything that we do is of public interest, and otherwise we wouldn't be doing it.
That's a really nice segue to Veena.
Thanks, Tanya, and really very inspiring to be on stage with all these amazing women. So I want to, of course, say it's certainly an honour, of course, to be here, and thanks, Monica, for really kind of inspiring us with some of the big ambitious goals of the journal, which I guess in a way comes to some of the work that we do at the Smart Centre at UNSW. The work really is very much about taking that bigger picture view of what science, engineering can actually achieve if we work in partnership with other disciplines. And I think typically, of course, that's been, you could argue, the one of the downsides of being in the technology related discipline areas, where you don't necessarily see the role of your work and how it fits with social scientists and how it can potentially create impact. And even I guess, dare I say, having science and engineering look beyond the sort of hardcore nature of what technical discipline is all about achieving, but look at, if I can put it this way, the impact if you were to combine your head and your heart together. So I think it's about what kind of decisions you would make if you were making those choices through a combination of the two. And I think a lot of interesting examples that have developed over the years in terms of how science and technology has evolved with solutions has been because it's been very sort of, single-minded. It's just basically said, right, we want to be able to develop a solution to, for example, extract gold out of electronic waste. And I'll pick that as an example because that's something that we're working on right now. But I mean, if you just go down that path and you say, right, I'm prepared to just pollute the environment. I mean, this is the crazy side of some of the work that, as we've gotten into it, we've seen. If I'm just prepared to pollute the environment, I'm just going to do whatever it takes. I'll use cyanide if that's what it takes, and I'll just get to the gold. And I mean, if you actually put the argument in that way, it sounds absolutely crazy that we've made decisions, and I say in a royal sort of big we, because of course somewhere in there is a combination of researchers and people in industry and so on, where we perhaps haven't challenged each other enough. So the question of, are we bringing together the sort of hardcore science, technology, engineering, along with the more human side of things? And I think the answer is probably not. We haven't actually done that in a way where we challenge ourselves, because a lot of technologies would not have come to light and would have never been implemented had we considered the bigger picture and the impact on humanity from day one. And I think to us, that's an important part of how we see development of technological solutions. Let's question and challenge ourselves from the very beginning and not sort of cause a pollution problem and then go, oops, where did we go wrong? So that's part of the thinking of what we do at the Smart Centre, in where we collaborate and work with end users and NGOs. It's really about saying, let's look at what the various pathways to solutions are. And if we are talking about, in this particular instance, some of the things that we're developing around recycling of electronic waste, how are we actually going to achieve those outcomes? Are we going to just allow all of the waste from advanced economies to just end up somewhere in developing economies. And we've all seen those horrific pictures of, waste being burnt in places like Africa. So are we just going to sit back and go, right, but actually there's a whole network and there's a whole system by which, a lot of this waste gets transported across into somewhere, and then we've done our bit for dealing with the problem. But the realities are that if you actually ask businesses, and dare I say sort of government offices and so on, no one really knows the answer as to where it goes ultimately. And of course, all we know is somewhere, somehow in the media, we end up seeing stories of just horrifying, shocking images. So we know that there is something that's not working in our systems and the way we manage our waste resources. And I use electronic waste and printed circuit boards and all of these things because we're used to seeing all of that. And that's exactly why, I mean, what we need to be able to do is create the kinds of solutions that enable us to look at the overall view of what that ideal solution for us would be as human beings if we were taking into account both making choices both from our heads and our heart. And I think that's the important point. So some of the new things that we're excited about is developing microfactories. These microfactories are really all around addressing a lot of these challenges that the world is facing in terms of how we address the more complex waste materials and enabling solutions that are fair and equitable for everyone on this planet. So that's really part of what we're doing with our microfactories.
Those microfactories, they're taking waste, there's a very not hashtagable phrase, non-revenue generating byproduct. And using it turning it into something useful on site. But I think that just either this week or next week, we're going to see the war on waste come back on television. And that's what you're talking about, isn't it? That people wait to see a problem and then think, what are we doing about it? I've heard you argue that we need to think bigger and think about green manufacturing. Tell us just in a nutshell the example of green steel. What's green steel and what's it an alternative to?
So the technology that Tanya is referring to is green steel. So we've basically developed this and green steel started its life on a little tiny furnace. I still can't get over the fact that we did some of the early experiments in those little tiny furnaces in our labs. It's now commercially running in many parts of the world, but the key element in that was the fact that we were able to show that you can use waste tires and use that as part of the process of making steel. More importantly, to reduce coal consumption in the process of making steel. So it was not just about, it's a nice alternative energy. Actually, quite the opposite. When we started the journey, it was very much about it's a raw material. Waste tires being a raw material for the very simple reason that at those temperatures of steel making, we were producing hydrogen molecules that allowed us effectively to use hydrogen in the process of steel making and doing it in a way that was affordable. So that was a critical question. So, for instance, if you want to be able to set up, green steel in places like Bangladesh, and I'm using that as an example because I've just had a request from someone who runs a steel plant in Bangladesh saying, we would love to be able to do this. It is affordable and it is doable and it achieves the outcomes, which is one, reducing coal consumption, so therefore lowering, the amount of sort of carbon footprint that typically a lot of these types of massive steel-making facilities and generally manufacturing facilities have, in terms of the energy consumption. But that, of course, is what manufacturing is all about. It uses a huge amount of energy. So if you can actually find a solution that is going to reduce carbon footprint, but do it in a way that's affordable, that's a huge plus. It's not about advocating some expensive technology that only a few can afford, but it's rather about making green manufacturing feasible and possible in a way that's affordable in any part of the world. And the critical sort of thinking behind that is if you can use waste resources, so in this case using waste tires in the process of making steel, then you can actually achieve those outcomes. So we've actually delivered on some of those early promises and goals that we had set up for green steel, and that's what it's all about.
It's interesting because it's affordable, more sustainable, but it's also local. I mean, it's hard to think of a place that doesn't generate waste tires that also has a need for new steel. I noticed Robyn's eyes light up when you were talking about gold. And it's not the reason you'd expect that, you know, Robyn's eyes didn't light up because of the idea of gold and bling. It was Veena talking about, you know, let's get the gold as in whatever way we can using cyanide, which is, I'm segueing quite nicely today, aren't we? We're segueing to your area of expertise, isn't it? So Robyn, tell us what you do and why you find gold interesting.
Okay, I guess I'll take a bit of a roundabout way to get to the gold.
Yep.
So I'm interested in, I guess, waste that you can't see. And
Now, don't be shy. Hold the microphone up closer.
Okay, but that's good. So waste you can't see, where we're using our atmosphere as that dumping ground. And while there's the climate gases, I come from a background of ozone chemistry, and so we've, of course, CFCs in that area. And in the decision to ban those, the replacement gases actually had huge global warming potentials, and so that wasn't a smart move. And if you'd have looked at it holistically, wouldn't have made those choices. And of course, those replacement gases have now been banned. And so, a few lessons to be learnt there. And coming to gold, I'm interested in mercury. And so mercury is a byproduct of fossil fuel burning. About 90% of the mercury that goes into the atmosphere is the major transport mechanism for mercury, and it's global pollutant, stays there for about a year. And so about 90% of the mercury in the atmosphere is from anthropogenic sources. And then it's invisible, it's around us, and it's in trace amounts. But it will accumulate via natural processes, a bit like the ozone hole, and the ozone hole happening because we've got cold temperatures, natural phenomena that happens happily but you put in an anthropogenic perturbation and suddenly you get things happening that you weren't expecting. And that's, for example, mercury will, through the processes of sea ice, you get sea salt building up there. When the sun returns, you're getting large mercury deposition happening in the Antarctic sea ice zone in the polar spring. And that is the time when you're getting all the biota kicking off and you're getting a big pulse of methyl mercury into the oceans there, and that bioaccumulates up, and it's the reason why petrels and albatrosses over the Southern Ocean have the largest amounts of methyl mercury of any seabirds in the world. And so you can see these cycles of what we do here actually has global implications, and that's why we have global policies in place, conventions and protocols. And so the Montreal Protocol, being the most successful environmental treaty to date, has done more for climate change protection than any other policy mechanism to date. I really hope I can stop saying that soon. And we're seeing that now with the Minamata Treaty Convention on Mercury. So that's one, we haven't had an international environmental treaty coming in for about 10 years, and that happened in 2013, that came in. So I work in areas of very reactive chemistry in the atmosphere, and sulfur's another one. So questions around corals in the Great Barrier Reef produce dimethyl sulfide. Dimethyl sulfide will get into our atmosphere, it will interact with water, forming aerosols and then clouds, and so self-regulation, cooling the surface, for example. So what happens to our climate when the corals get extremely stressed and then die? So those sort of questions, those interesting questions of our perturbations to the system, what are they doing to these natural biogeochemical cycles?
So it sounds very much like the kind of thing that Monica quite likes publishing, the human systems and the interacting. So that tangent of gold that I was talking about, how does mercury and cyanide come into discussion of gold?
Oh yes, I forgot.
What's the cost of our bling?
Mercury and gold have a really close affiliation, and sulfur as well. And so where you find these, you find them in our deep ore deposits, generally together, and so mercury is often used to extract gold, and then a very effective way of getting rid of and collecting that gold is to burn it, right? The mercury just goes into the atmosphere, and that happens on these artisanal gold mines in generally relatively poor regions where they're wanting to collect the gold and then sell it on for cosmetic purposes. And the exposures, you see these pictures of children standing in mercury-filled water extracting this gold, and the exposures to these populations. Mercury is pretty insidious. It's a bit like how we put lead in petrol. Mercury makes you crazy, lead makes you angry. Because we put lead in petrol, which was an incredibly stupid thing to do, we got 60 million excess crime cases. Wow. And so you can ask the questions, what is the impacts of putting or using this mercury in these ways, for something that's decorative? Gold really doesn't have many uses outside, or its value is largely because we place a large amount of value on it.
It just strikes me as so strange that cyanide extraction was the less harmful way of extracting gold. But and we're talking about what amounts of, say, a ton of ore yields 5 to 30 grams of gold. Veena, do you know offhand, a ton of mobile phones or e-waste, do you know how much gold we can get out of e-waste?
Yeah, so if you were to use as a rough sort of guide about a ton, which equates to about 6,000 handsets, and so you're looking at about 130 kilograms of copper in there, and you've got about tin probably. Maybe it's so copper equates to about 10-20% on a circuit board. You've got tin, so I'm just sort of giving you rough sort of numbers there with copper at the top end of the spectrum. Tin is about 5%, and then everything sort of underneath that, so all the precious metals, we're talking about silver and gold, they are definitely a lot smaller. So you've got about 30 or so grams of kilograms of silver, this is, and now you're coming down to 0.3 kilograms of gold. So you've got
a 300
very
grams, that's
300
times the amount in the ore.
That's right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you look at that sort of multiplier effect, 10 times is a good number to take as a broad sort of conversion for most of these metals. So for absolutely, for something like gold, it probably would be even more than 10-20 times. For copper, about 10 times or so. So it's just giving you that context of the fact that it's significantly greater in terms of using where our waste resources are offering this tremendous opportunity, and to not go down the path that we've gone down before in terms of sort of learning from our experiences and not sort of repeating the same mistakes over and over again, which is saying, well, I'll just go back and extract now, all the horrible sort of difficult materials. Again, question is cobalt and lithium and a lot of these types of materials, not to mention rare earths. So you don't want to sort of go down the path, make the same mistake, and then go, oh, oops, wait a minute, there's all of that pile of waste there, which actually is a really good resource. So we're hoping that this time around, the world will learn lessons and will be able to be a little bit more holistic, but also, mindful of the consequences of our actions, and look at all of these alternative resources.
So where other people see rubbish and waste, you see potential. Now I'm going to work through the group, and I'm going to get each of you to give an example of, like, today we've promised to share the success stories of where research and policy have come together to produce some outcomes. Where have we got some transdisciplinary and cross-sector work happening where we've got academics, good solid research contributing to something that has outcomes for societal benefit. So I'll start next to me with Rebekah.
I think most certainly in the urban water space, there's been a growing interdisciplinary academic community, probably the last 2 decades, particularly the last 15 years. The name of water-sensitive urban design's been coined in Australia. There are example projects in developments that started 15 to 10 years ago. So it went from laboratory work to sort of low-cost development areas. Docklands here is full of water-sensitive urban design. And so what's happened, and that's, architects, engineers, economists, social scientists, historians, there's over 20 disciplines. And there's in 2012, the federal government funded a $120 million CRC, Cooperative Research Centre, for water-sensitive cities. And so this is in policy and in regulation in local government, state government. It's picked up in national policy. It's not mainstream everywhere, but it's becoming more mainstream in education, and it's mainstream for many developers. So organisations like here in Victoria, Melbourne Water, have a offset scheme for developers. If you don't introduce water-sensitive urban design, then you've got to do something over here. So this has been an academic inspiration that has had a whole lot of excellence done, but done in a way that's relevant and has a lot of impact. And so that work now is in policy codes in the UK and in Europe, and there's low impact design in North America, and there's LLID in New Zealand, so all sharing that philosophy. And now that pursuit is being taken to informal settlements, which is sort of what I spoke about before. So it is a success. But it's very hard. What this community has not been able to achieve, that I'm very cognizant of, is that we're missing the equal amount of research excellence, relevance and impact, focusing on how do you retire unsustainable practices. We're so good at the innovation and the spread of the innovation, and it's almost like it's not exciting. I've got a very small Australian Research Council grant looking at how you retire unsustainable. To get postdocs interested in it, it's just not sexy. But this is the area that I don't think we are successful in general, but in this area of water-sensitive cities. So we've been really good at scaling up innovation and spreading it, but at the same time we haven't built the capability and the insight that's really needed, and the partnerships to understand how do you retire more efficiently, more speedily, more effectively, the unsustainable and, on all accounts, from a business case perspective, more competitive mainstream solution.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I think one of the... I've heard the phrase choice editing in government policy. If people don't have the choice to buy rubbish inefficient white goods, for example, then we don't have people with machines that cost a lot to run. And I remember looking at, back when I was on the board of Sustainability Victoria, one of our most successful programs was being involved in the Energy Efficiency Council to no longer sell, to lift the minimum energy performance standard of white goods so that you can't sell the ones that are energy guzzlers. So that's such an interesting point you make about retiring the dinosaurs, I think might be a phrase that resonates.
And I mean, and the idea of changing legislation and changing policy is not an end into itself. Going from a change in policy and change in regulation, that's huge. But then taking it through to implementation, all the capacity building, the informal convening, the understanding the theory of change in practice, unblocking the barriers, that's a massive piece of work. So in the research community, we often think a change in policy, a big treaty or a new piece of legislation means the solution's been achieved, but and often practice comes ahead of a change of legislation and policy. And so that idea of the order of things, I think that we haven't spent enough time on that as well.
Yeah.
But there is lots of successes. I'll talk about it.
Well, Kath, that's a perfect place for you to come in. I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I was sitting here when you posed the question and I'm like, I've been working in climate change policy for about 15 years and at the national, international and local level, and a lot of that time was spent working on things like emissions trading. So I was like, heart sinks at prospect of something that's actually, where research has been super important in all of the work done on climate and energy policy in Australia. We've drawn very heavily on both the natural sciences in terms of making the case of what emission reductions are required and the impacts that you would face if you don't make those reductions, and then the economic and social sciences, particularly economics, of what's the range of policy options and what's the most cost-effective way to achieve those emission reductions. There's been very strong collaboration between government policymakers and research institutions in Australia on all of those questions, and we've had emissions trading once and don't have it now, and there seems very little prospect of it coming back anytime soon.
Well, at a federal level, but I mean, like one thing that I think is quite interesting was EcoCity World Summit, when it was here, some of the papers presented at that conference were really focused on the emerging role and the things that are happening at a sub-national level. So I imagine that part of it, there was a lot of energy that came out of Trump pulling out of Paris and what's happening in Australia at a federal level, and it's almost like you're now at state government level, and the things we're seeing at state and local government, particularly major cities like City of Melbourne, and they're also collaborating with researchers. I suspect you're in a really interesting space for seeing some of this work move forward and happen on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. And so, there's the emissions trading story, and then there's just the broader conversation. And so one of the things that I would showcase in terms of the science policy intersect is the work that's been done on emission budgets, carbon budgets, and the connection between carbon budgets and temperature goals in the international conversations, and the global goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees, shooting for 1.5. There's some just inexorable math in the climate science that tells us that there's only a certain quantum of emissions which we can globally emit if we want to stay within those boundaries. And carbon budgets, whilst they've been an inquiry within science for a bit longer, they have come very strongly into the policy conversation. And so I had the opportunity to work with researchers like Malte Meinshausen here at Melbourne University when I was at the Climate Change Authority previously, where we brought that concept of global carbon budgets very squarely to the centre of what's a sensible target for Australia and what's a sensible target not just for 2020 or for 2030, but what's the emission budget that Australia could fairly and reasonably claim as its share of that global pie. And whilst the recommendations of the Climate Change Authority weren't adopted by the current federal government, they are still squarely in the public conversation about what Australia's emission reduction ambitions should be. And one of the things I've been able to do in the move to the state government, because we've now just established this architecture of what's Victoria's contribution, what's Victoria's role in terms of reducing emissions, is to essentially downscale that national picture into, well, what's Victoria's fair share of the national pie? And if Victoria is serious about making its fair contribution to keeping warming well below 2 degrees and keeping that 1.5 goal in prospect, which is outrageously ambitious, and anyone who knows anything about the science and about emissions trends knows that even staying anything below 2 degrees is a radical shift from our current state of play. But looking at that and saying, well, if we're serious about that goal, we've put net zero in our emissions, we've put the global goal in our legislation, then what does that mean in terms of Victoria's emission reduction pathway from now to 2050? And again, picking up that conversation with the researchers here at Melbourne University and elsewhere to check that the science that we used at the Climate Change Authority remains relevant and appropriate for our uses, and then essentially adding an extra layer of analysis to bring that down to the state scale to inform Victoria's actions.
Actually, that state scale stuff, that work that you do, I think is really interesting as well, because we've talked a bit about climate change mitigation, you know, the reduction in our contribution of emissions, but there's also a whole adaptation piece of work as well. Tell us a bit about how, you know, you and the department have worked with researchers to take that global climate change science and look at what it means for Victoria, and then to almost act as a conduit to say to local governments, to other users who need to know what they have to prepare for. Tell us a bit about that work, because it really does bring policy and research together.
Absolutely. And so within the context of Victoria's Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which is, again, one of those rolling, periodically updated plans for Victoria's action, part of what we did was look at, well, what's the state's role? And part of the state's role is to make good information available to a whole range of planners and decision makers in a form that's useful for them, for the decisions that they need to make and the actions they need to take. And so we've been working with CSIRO to essentially take what are kind of global and national scale climate projections under different possible futures. Now, climate change is replete with a million different possibilities in terms of how the world might play out, but you pick a few cameos and then to essentially we call it dynamically downscaled data. And it's taking projections which are usually at a pretty rough kind of regional scale, sort of if you're looking at it on a map, it might be 100 by 100 square kilometres of space is a single pixel in the projections, and so everything in that space has the same projected future. And we're working with CSIRO to be able to downscale that to get more granularity into the picture. And so we're working from, say, like 100 by 100 to a 5 by 5 square kilometre. So instead of just getting a kind of a very general picture of what the future in your part of Victoria might look like, you get that more detailed picture. And that's helpful for just storytelling in terms of what's it going to look like, what might it look like for me. It's not always the right data because climate projections are uncertain and there are some things that are more or less robust at different scales. And so part of that project is also working with CSIRO to develop supporting material to help people, one, understand what the hell it is that this information is telling them, and two, to help them figure out what's the right data for me to use in my circumstances. And so it's that combination of the kind of the hard science of climate projections and the soft science of translating that into practice and decision making.
Good. Veena, we're going to talk rubbish again, aren't we?
Yeah.
Only it's resources. Now, one thing that I wanted to ask you about is tell us about the microfactories in a nutshell, because they're making use of waste resources, but also generating economic benefit. But the thing that I find interesting that Veena told me about in sort of our pre-event conversation was the role that EPA and their grant program had in making this a reality. So we've got all these. I think you can give us an interesting perspective in who have been the players and what decisions were made where and how did it help. So what was UNSW's role? What people are putting in microfactories? How do government grants help? Should government be umpire? Should they provide seed funding? Should they be a major player? What's the role for different people in this space in order for us to get a better bang for our buck with material resources?
So I think, certainly this is, one of those classic examples where you do have to think about a multifaceted approach. You can't just assume that it's going to be this nice sort of linear pathway from here's research going about doing its thing, and then a few years down the road, we've got someone picking up on that research. Now, making that comment, having gone through that journey with green steel myself, where, you sort of go down that path where you sort of, expect one thing after another. And of course, it does make you sometimes a little bit impatient because you think, hang on, the science and everything else is telling me this is the right thing to do. So with green steel, and I'll contrast that now, what's happening with microfactories, is that it was a slow process, or at least in my mind, it was a slow process in terms of how we went from your typical sort of research grants and bringing the end users on board and then really disseminating the technology globally. But I think if we had to broadly now step back and go green manufacturing, and we're going to use resources, waste resources for purposes of manufacturing, there's no reason why state governments, which actually have that sort of responsibility, front and center responsibility in terms of managing waste and EPA and so on and so forth, shouldn't actually see their role in enabling new green manufacturing technologies and green products to be developed. So indeed, in New South Wales, one of the new programs that they've recently announced is called new product improvement grants. So these product improvement grants are really all about businesses who can indeed show that they can take waste resources and not just sort of call it, oh, here's a nice recycling grant and go off and, figure out a nice way to kind of sort your rubbish out and we'll give you a grant.
That's how it's tended to happen, hasn't it?
Exactly. So
go and
far,
buy a big recycling plant. Here's a grant. Go and get this big, huge piece of equipment. It's not sort of. This is a different kind of grant, isn't it?
Exactly right. So the product improvement program in New South Wales, which has been announced, has been more about, if there are new products that can be developed, obviously out of waste resources, then that's really where businesses can put their hand up for, CapEx funding. Or 50% or so of the grant. So I think that's an example of where, it's becoming obvious that there are obviously people like Kath and others in other parts of the country who are sort of paying attention to what's coming out from the research side and saying, okay, well, let's all kind of work together. Because you can imagine if you've got an SME, a small business that wants to do something like that, but really doesn't have the funds to set up a microfactory and to enable green manufacturing to kind of kick off in their business, then where do you start? It's always going to be a chicken and egg problem. If you provide enough funding for that initial capex and a business can actually kick things off, start to manufacture products out of resources, waste resources, they've got then products that have got a market opportunity. So mind you, of course, a case has to be made up front that you're actually going to create value-added materials. It's no point making something that's going to end up in landfill. So that's another point I sort of, make that as a very strong argument that, when we talk about green manufacturing, it's got to be very much about the value add, and it's got to be about products that society needs, and it's actually making a positive contribution to the environment by reducing our carbon footprint, reducing the energy consumption, and creating truly green products that are going to be far more sustainable than the existing solutions. So it's a very difficult case that an applicant has to make. So when a business is putting up a case like that to the government, there's a whole lot of sustainability arguments that they've got to fulfill. There's the economic viability of their case. There's got to be the environmental sustainability and effectively the product itself. So it's by no means an easy task to get across, I'm sure, over the line in terms of getting a grant like that. But at least what it does is so many different businesses have now looked at this opportunity. And I said, whoa, okay, wait a minute. So I don't just have to do a clean and sorting kind of recycling. I can actually make products. What that then means is for businesses, it pushes them along to do more manufacturing. So we've got one of our industry partners who is, a collector of waste. I don't want to call them recyclers because they weren't recyclers, and they're in many instances they're not. They're simply collecting and sorting. So in this case, for this particular business, it was about, wait a minute, I can suddenly become a manufacturer. Wow. So this is cool. Why is it fantastic for this particular business? Because it's actually creating a whole new pathway for actually providing sustainable solutions. And I think that's the key word there, is about how do you develop new opportunities for sustainable solutions through value add. And the value add is important because that then means that these microfactories are enabling actually job creation and creating value and doing it in a way that's decentralized and, most importantly, affordable. Because again, I come back to that point about affordability. So whether you're in a remote community in Australia or in India, it doesn't matter. It's about the point that ultimately these sustainable solutions have to be affordable. They've got to be part of the value chain, and they've got to meet the needs of society. So I think for us to be able to see what these types of new grant opportunities can actually deliver for communities is going to be fabulous. But look, I mean, having said that, even with something like green steel, even though I sort of keep saying, well, the journey wasn't quite fast enough, and I wish we would have, we would have been able to do things faster. But I think all credit to, of course, the building councils and the rating agencies and so on. So when our industry partner obviously put up the bid to say, look, we're using recycled tires and this is the steel we're making, they ended up picking up an extra Green Star rating on the green steel product that's being commercially produced. So it was nice for, I guess, in a way, the industry that had taken on the lead role, because remember, they also bear a lot of risk, that the agencies and the authorities responded by recognizing that this was a mammoth task to be able to produce green steel using one of the inputs as waste resources. So that additional Green Star rating meant that it enables them to put that up forward in many projects where they might be seen as, a preferred, input material of green steel as opposed to something that might have been made through conventional processing technologies.
I think there's two really important, interesting points in there. One is Australia could have a manufacturing future. So the other is, you talked about the specifying, like the ability to gain Green Star points by having building materials like green steel that use recycled products. Then you've got a driver in there that incentivises it, and it's also a recognised program that the government can support through other ways. So there's some really good things there that help make that drive it through. So it's not just people in isolation trying to go against inertia and push something forward. And Veena and I were talking about this, and I thought it's funny that it's the same thing in mining. People have often criticised Australia for, we view ourselves as the world's quarry and we dig all this stuff and ship it overseas without value adding. Microfactories, it's the same thing. It's not just sorting things, that not being a recycler, it's being a manufacturer and value adding. It seems like sort of common sense, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, well, that's right. Because, when you talk about green manufacturing, that's exactly what it should deliver. It should deliver value add, because that's where you make, products that society needs. And if you've generated enough revenue through manufacturing, then you've automatically sort of delivered, social benefits in those communities, because you've actually generated jobs within those, communities where those types of jobs may not even have existed. So it's that whole sort of argument of, are we creating a new economy around waste resources by creating manufacturing solutions, by enabling small decentralized microfactories to allow for that to happen, where traditionally people might have just seen manufacturing as this sort of massive, big, expensive, industry that, of course, not too many people can afford to have. Whereas if you can actually think about it as, again, small enough, decentralized, and it's possible to actually have it in a small town somewhere, then suddenly it changes the way people think about manufacturing, but more importantly, doing manufacturing that is built on the foundation of one resource that we all generate everywhere in the world, which is waste. So if we've all got, plenty of waste resources to build, green manufacturing solutions, then why shouldn't we be looking at it? And every sort of town could well be looking at that as a customized solution for what that particular township could possibly set up and do, and what small businesses might want to see happen based on where the communities are located. But I think also the other very important, in a way, the non-tangible benefit out of all of that is that morale in society. Because often, people sort of talk about when traditional manufacturing jobs, kind of die out, then people sort of go, hang on, suddenly the towns have to shut down because, everyone's sort of looking for jobs and there aren't enough jobs. So it's all of those other non-tangible benefits which have ultimately an impact on community and the morale and people. So I think those are important outcomes if we can start to think about what manufacturing can do for economies, and particularly economies where there hasn't been, any sort of formal manufacturing that has taken place. So whether it's an opportunity to build something that has never existed before. So I'm really super excited about that kind of feedback. And you're absolutely right. I think manufacturing is something that's, becoming much more important in the Australian conversation, which I think really fabulous to see that happen.
And it's localised. I mean, especially in a country like Australia that has such a large land area but a diffuse population. We'll go on to, Robyn, your success story is we're going from local to global here with Montreal Protocol. So this is the time when we actually saw international government cooperation to come around and agree to change some pollutants going into the atmosphere. And I think that in some ways is sort of a beacon of hope for what we might do with climate change. But tell us sort of what worked about Montreal and how is that, because that battle isn't entirely won, isn't it? We're still working on getting rid of and managing ozone depleting substances. Tell us about, Montreal through to today.
Wow.
In a nutshell.
I guess, so it was in the 70s that they realised that these chlorine and bromine containing substances, which were extremely stable, which is why they're used as fire retardants and refrigerants, etc., were going into our atmosphere and they would break down in the stratosphere. And so the implications of the science originally and the Nobel Prizes that followed for the scientists there was because that recognition that these substances would, break down around 40 kilometres, and that was like, okay, that's bad, we should do something about that. And that's why it seemed like when the ozone hole was formed, which was completely unexpected, or it was found over Antarctica, which was unexpected, it seemed like the reaction of the international community was extremely fast, but actually in effect, the Vienna Convention was already in place, and so the Montreal Protocol, which came on the back of that, and then was it's now universally ratified, the only environmental treaty to have that universal ratification. That came into effect essentially 3 years after the discovery of the ozone hole. So it seemed like the timeline was very fast, but there were lags in there. And that policy and protections came in place well before the science consensus came into place, because, of course, there was for a long time in the 90s and even into the 2000s the idea that, the science is all wrong, we don't understand it, we shouldn't have these measures in place. But the implications for society weren't as large or nearly as challenging as what we're seeing with climate change. So there were a few things that Montreal got right, and those were around trade. And so the trade and the economic part of that, where the developing nations would, the technology transfer, the ability to monitor, or monitoring as part of the protocol as well, and those sort of measures, those were really successful. And so when I came in very late in the game, I guess, but coming in to see what was in place here in Australia with the Air Archive that CSIRO maintains, they are one of the world's best in being able to actually go back and say, hey, there's this new substance in our atmosphere, we can measure that now, and back through time, essentially. And so those scientists worked very closely with the refrigeration industry and with the head negotiators within the Department of Energy and Environment here in Australia. So really close-knit community who are actually interested in the ozone science and changing it. And going to your point about, are we still challenged? Like, isn't the ozone hole completely fixed and we move on? It's going to take years for the ozone hole to fully mend. We're looking at a 2050 recovery to 1980 levels. And so over that time, we are being subjected to higher UV levels here in the Southern Hemisphere. We anyway have 50% more UV at the surface relative to the Northern Hemisphere for the same latitude. And so that's why we say, or you often hear the ozone hole, it's the ozone hole over Australia. The ozone hole is not over Australia. And so, but it's that high UV and the sun-smart schools, I think, bringing it back to the local successes. What child goes outside at lunchtime without a hat and sunblock on here in Australia? And so there's huge gains, and most people are pretty conversant in ozone and UV and Antarctic ozone hole. So those are big successes in the public health space. And I think I'd love to see air action plans for all our schools, so that when we have our prescribed burns here in Victoria and flood our urban areas with smoke, for example, we aren't having school kids running around when they could get asthma triggering events. So lots of success in the ozone, lots of work still to be done.
Yeah. I think it's encouraging to know that it can be done. Now we're going to throw it open to you guys for questions in a moment, so start thinking about what you'd like to ask. But I just have a question for any takers, that nature sustainability is looking at transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research, and we talked earlier about the breaking down of silos, and particularly, Rebekah, with you at Monash Sustainable Development Institute being very much a cross-faculty effort. How important, how much of this work could we have got done if we stayed within our silos, if science just did science and didn't talk to social scientists? How important has been researching together across disciplines, broadening what we view as our focus within government, not just looking at environmental health, let's look after whatever's going to make the frogs sick. No, let's think of public health and the human health consequences. How important has that broadening and collaboration and sharing of information been? Any takers?
So at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, we're a university-wide institute. We're about 95 staff,
and we work across the 10 faculties. So everything we do is really at that HAS-STEM interface. And we've been very active of moving beyond arguing that you need to be interdisciplinary, it's important and it's a barrier. I actually had this conversation at dinner last night. We're at that point of trying to figure out some very core principles about how you actually do it and the machinations of doing it, and the conversation needs to move to that to sort of scale it and normalise it further. So in my opinion, focusing on grand challenges and focusing on developing solutions, propagating solutions, and making sure it's evidence-based has to be a HAS-STEM enterprise. Mm-hmm. Whether it's HAS-STEM at the outset or at the start, or whether it starts a bit more HAS or a bit more STEM and then it's more linear, I think depends on the topic. And also, so I'm already there. I'm already like, it's critical. But we need more principles and norms. So, for example, the last two big, large interdisciplinary projects that I've led in this current one, you know, over years you go through moments of needing to be monodisciplinary, needing to be interdisciplinary, needing to be transdisciplinary. You quickly spike down to being mono. So there's like processes that we don't share, and there isn't many venues to share that, to scale it up, to normalise it, and to give it legitimacy in its own right. And I'm hoping that nature sustainability will be the home for that, which I think is really, really critical. So nature sustainability can be an enabler of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work. I also think that working across that broader sort of HAS-STEM, HAS being humanities, arts and social sciences for STEM people, we mainly know STEM, working across that interface, one of the biggest challenges I think we have in sustainable development globally is we're really good at demonstration projects. So we do something in a region, we innovate a technology, we innovate a planning scheme, we change a piece of legislation, and we celebrate it as a success. But if you actually look beyond that, scaling from the innovation to mainstream practice is, I think, the biggest challenge in sustainable development, whether it's around, you know, economic metrics for social and environmental value, or whether it's about mainstreaming this really amazing piece of building technology that could be put everywhere, or mainstreaming, you know, micro green manufacturing. We don't know how to do that, and it's interdisciplinary research which could map that out, and interdisciplinary research that can enable and do the researching. I'm not talking exactly action research, I am talking research. So I just think it's essential, and it's not at the expense of high quality monodisciplinary research. These things are not mutually exclusive. Very strong, credible monodisciplinary research is important foundations for everything, but we need that HAS-STEM interdisciplinary research platforms to have the same legitimacy and the same. We need to unpack it and understand it. We know how to do monodisciplinary. We know all the norms for different disciplines and what's considered credible and what's not, and, you know, etc., and how control and comparison works in a HAS sense and how it works in a STEM sense and the major differences, and we know all that. But that big interdisciplinary enterprise, we've got to unpack that and understand that more, and I think that will be the vehicle for the scaling. That's my hunch. I don't know that as fact, that's my hunch.
Good point. Now I think we have a question here. Is that right? Did I see someone with a microphone? No, it's the person with the
Sebastian Thomas from the University of Melbourne. Thank you all very much. So we have a recognition by all kinds of scholars and practitioners that interdisciplinarity is critical to these long-term effective outcomes in this space. We have recognition from major publishers like Nature, starting a journal like Nature Sustainability that show us how important this type of thinking is, and we have structures that systemically constrain interdisciplinary practice in the scholarly community in Australia. We have a research infrastructure that prevents us from pursuing interdisciplinary practice. So I guess my question to the panel is, given the Australian Research Council's fields of research and that whole infrastructure that we have, how do we as scholars and practitioners affect policy by taking our recognition that interdisciplinary science is critical? What can we do further as sustainability institutes and as individual researchers? How can we make that policy change?
I'm going to make a trite comment to begin, which is get out of academia and get into government. In the preps for this, I had a chat with Tanya, and one of the things, and in the introductory comments, there was that thing about the silos, the hard silos in academia, and it's something that I've just never experienced in the practice of environmental policy making in government. There's definitely institutional cultures across different departments, and there's disciplinary biases across departments, but any public policy problem that a government is really committed to tackling and indeed to solving, by necessity must draw on thinking and analysis and perspectives from a whole range of different disciplines and backgrounds. And it's kind of like the echo of the public consultation in policy making, that policies don't stick. And if they don't stick, they won't work if they aren't supported by and speak to the interests of a whole range of different groups. And so in the same way that fundamental public policy practice involves going out and talking to lots of different groups and crafting something that might not be satisfactory to any single one of them, but as a whole works and will stick and will endure. In the same way, the analysis and the research that we bring to solving that problem needs to draw on all the different disciplines. And so how do you do it? Well, I'm not going to speak to the internal workings of universities. There's other people here with much greater background on that. But certainly the best and richest engagements I've had with academics in public policy have been people who, one, are interested in solving problems in the real world and are willing to kind of meet you where you are. It's not about letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. It happens in public policy, it happens in government, it certainly happens in research communities. And yet, actually, if we want to solve problems, then it's about what's the space that's plausible in terms of the solutions that might be offered, and then how can we craft something that will take that first step. And then, you know, thinking long term, it's like, well, first step to better solutions over time.
Anyone want to add anything to that?
Oh, I guess, I mean, you know, one of the key ways to get academics to respond would actually be having appropriate KPIs. You know, I mean, that's up to an institution to define what KPIs you have. But I think it's like every other metrics, right? I mean, we have metrics related to, you know, the sort of traditional ways in which we measure research and teaching performance. So there's no reason why you can't have metrics that determine, you know, how we engage and work with, you know, policymakers and end users and NGOs, and how do we do all of that? So I'm sure, you know, various institutes can take it upon themselves to define what those KPIs and what those metrics are. And ultimately, you know, for an academic, it's really about making sure that they're then, you know, able to respond equally across the full spectrum of what their role is in society. So I guess I'd probably be even asking a more fundamental question, you know, should an academic just sit in their own little sort of silo and say, I'm just here to do my own little thing and I don't care about the rest of the world around me? I mean, you know, so I think to me, that's an important question to ask. The sort of philosophical question. I think if we can get the right answers crafted in a way that is doable and KPIs appropriately, you know, measure and pick up the work, the good work that a lot of academics do in this space, I think it's giving due recognition to all the hard work and effort that goes into it. I mean, I think, Monica, you alluded to that in your talk in the morning, that, you know, yes, academics are expected to do all of these, but I think in a way, if you can appropriately measure it and quantify, the work that's going in, because it's not something that happens overnight. So that's the other thing. It's recognizing the journey and the work that you're doing along the way in that space. And I think if you can actually start to, as an institution, measure performance, so therefore have KPIs that reflect the level of engagement and leadership that an academic might be playing, in that particular space, in addition to your other research and teaching responsibilities, but how you're achieving a holistic outcome, not just for yourself in a way, if I can put it that way, but how that nicely complements, the goals and how you help others achieve outcomes. And the others could well be your colleagues, your whole institute, the end users you partner with, the NGOs. So I think in terms of measuring performance, there's got to be something in there that speaks to how you've also enabled and facilitated others to achieve their goals and outcomes. And I think unless and until we can define holistic KPIs, and always move away from this very individual-driven metrics, which is how many papers have you published? But if it is indeed collaborative papers, we talked about papers with in partnership with your end users and so on, then I think to me that will automatically set benchmark for good practices, and that's what we all should aspire to do.
Now, Rebekah has something to add. I'll get you to be fairly quick so we can fit in one more question before we wrap up. So.
That's a really hard question, of course, but there are academics that do interdisciplinary research in the Australian system, and you've got to be, like Veena here, very entrepreneurial and interpret rules in certain ways and make business cases and arguments in certain ways to realise your interdisciplinary research. But in terms of sort of the policy system, I would argue that NHMRC is more supportive of interdisciplinary research, say, than ARC. But I think we need to be advocating what's happening globally as a research community. So if you have a look at Rockefeller, Gates, Wellcome, the big charities, big funders, they're now talking about planetary health, interdisciplinarity. They're big funders and they're prestigious funders. They're starting to change the debate, nature sustainability. So the big landmark pieces are changing. We've got to be good at articulating the value of that. And I'm not sure if you know this, Monica, in the Australian funding system, we don't have such a strong philanthropic culture here compared to, say, North America or Europe. And also we don't have a tax relief culture here that's really supportive of R&D in some of our... So there's quite a lot of work that can be done in our business development, R&D, sort of legislative incentive sector. And we have to really think about whether we want to, from a policy setting, start stimulating a more philanthropic culture here or not, which many other nations sort of depend on. And when you've got philanthropic money and R&D money from the business community, that's much more, because philanthropists and businesses, their questions are all interdisciplinary, largely. They're about problems. So, so there's many parts to this challenge.
I have to smile because I did notice when I was, on those crazier moments when I've contemplated a PhD, I noticed that I could get a $100,000 scholarship if I wanted to do a PhD on something to do with coal. Funnily enough, but didn't think that was likely.
But I think also, to say something for, to pick up on a lot of these conversations, I think it's really, really important that we now have a vehicle such as Nature Sustainability's vehicle to be able to have this type of work published at the highest level possible. So I think that's important because I think, in a way that academic credibility coupled with bringing together a whole range of other pathways to solutions that you couldn't have done before. Before it was very much as we've said.
Veena, if you didn't quite fit in nature climate change, how valuable for it is you to have something that's nature branded?
Oh, look, absolutely critical, and I think this is why my point about recognizing that with nature sustainability now for people like me, and I'm sure many others, that whole ability to be able to publish in journals where that highest standard is actually what you aspire to, I think is so important. And particularly if were basically looking at your work, getting into nature, you, of course, didn't have other pathways if you are working in the kind of spaces that people like us do. So I think to us, that's another important, mechanism by which, high quality research gets that recognition. But also equally importantly, then your end users who want to participate and be a part of that collaboration, I think is fantastic. So suddenly it's sort of uncovered that whole, I guess, hidden gems that are already sort of out there. And I think we really want to be able to create that opportunity for more of this type of work to come through, which no doubt it will now as a result of this opportunity.
Last quick question here in the front row, if we could have the microphone down here. Or
my name's Ian Blair.
Got a microphone coming? Yeah.
Agriculturalist and master tree grower. The question I want to raise is none of you have really mentioned the huge scaling up that can be done with agriculture. If we change some of the policies, that if you cut down a tree, it's then not counted, whereas if it goes into building, there's Delhi Chen here who's done a lot of work with if we use legumes to replace nitrogen fertiliser, we can do huge amounts within agriculture, and Victoria's very good with agriculture. What is being done in that area to get the right policies that we can scale up and reduce our footprint by using agriculture?
Kath, is that in your remit? Sort of.
Just happy to speak to that. Wide-ranging conversation, certainly not going to touch on every sector, but agriculture's an important source of emissions here in Australia, and the things put in the agriculture bucket are usually emissions from livestock and emissions from fertiliser use. The emissions from energy sits in the energy sector bucket. But within the architecture of the Climate Change Act that I referred to earlier, agriculture is one of the sectors that will need to come up with it's called the sector pledge. So the Agriculture Minister will be responsible for developing a sector pledge for agriculture, which is the set of policies and programs that they're going to use to drive emissions reductions in the agriculture sector. That's on the state government's part. There's also programs like Take Two, which is a voluntary pledge program for business and community to essentially make their contribution to Victoria's climate action, and that's not dependent upon state support. That's about what businesses are already doing. And if you look within the agriculture sector, organisations like Dairy Australia and the Meat and Livestock Association are already setting pretty ambitious emission reduction goals, in part because they're keeping an eye to what's going to maintain market access into the future, particularly as global action on climate change ratchets up. On the sequestration side, so the land use side, which is like a separate bucket within emissions accounting, but that's about afforestation, reforestation and deforestation, land use change. So at the moment, the main policy at the national level is the Emissions Reduction Fund, and that's basically government paying people to reduce emissions, and a large part of that is in the land, like most of the a very large slab of the credits under the Emissions Reduction Fund are in the land sector, and it's about changing practices with respect to our forestry activities and particularly deforestation. But over time, I would expect to see more and more activity in that space, particularly because as many emission reduction goals are, like Victoria's, defined as net zero. That means that by 2050, if we do have residual emissions, we will need an equivalent amount of sequestration to offset those so that the balance is zero. And the main contender in that space now and almost certainly into the future will be the land sector. It'll be about sequestration opportunities, and it will also be, as you say, capitalising on the opportunities of harvested wood products. And so that's about the carbon sequestered in long-lived products, not just paper or things that have a very short life, but where you're using, for example, structural timber products in construction, the way in which that carbon value and sequestration value can be recognised in our carbon accounts, and then that value realised through carbon markets in the future. It's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Kath. You know, I like that long-lived, short-lived carbon, although I will say that I justify my bookcase, my book collection to my husband. I say it's stored carbon. It's really important that I keep and buy more books and have more books. On that note, that's pretty much all we have time for, but to make a wrap-up comment, I've actually asked each of our panellists and Monica as well to cast their minds forward to January 2028, in which we'll see the 10th anniversary edition of Nature Sustainability. I've asked them to sort of imagine, you know, what would you like to see in that edition? You know, what would you write? What would you like to read? What would you like to see in that? So let's start off with you, Rebekah, and 25 words or less, short, sharp and shiny.
Nature Sustainability claims the solidification of an interdisciplinary research platform globally. Nature Sustainability has, from then on, or maybe the last few years, every paper published on a solution has a very clear impact statement, and one of the industry partners or policy leaders or politicians writes what's being done to scale that solution as a paired thing to that paper, so that I'm sure I've done more than 25 words, but something like that. So it's an enabler as well as a receptacle of quality research.
Thought bubble. Benchmarking all of the next round of Paris pledges under the global climate regime against the national and global emissions budgets. And so that idea of global constraint being really mapped into countries' own commitments.
Veena.
So nature sustainability has shown pathways to top 100 solutions which have been developed in partnership with businesses, NGOs, policymakers, and researchers, which wouldn't have happened otherwise without nature sustainability. So the top 100 list is emerged.
I'd like to see, like all industries, perhaps even the higher education sector being one of those institutions that nature sustainability has driven to produce metrics around their sustainability goals.
Monica?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I'd like us to be able to celebrate in our 10th anniversary full inclusion of authorship from the Global South on an even level with authorship from the Global North. That would be a huge success, I think.
I think I might wrap up by saying that what I'd like to see in February or March 2028 is some sort of global summit between leaders somewhere where the President of the United States, whoever he or she be at that time, and maybe a few other world leaders come up to the Prime Minister of Australia, whoever he or she is, and say, I read in Nature Sustainability about that fantastic work you're doing in Australia, and then the conversation continues from there. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our panel a round of applause. Thank you, Rebekah, Kath, Veena, Robyn, and Monica as well.